welcome to a bite-sized introduction to rivers. What we are going to focus on in this part of the lesson are the key words. Now, the very obvious place to start is the start. Ergo, where does a river start? The starting point of a river we call the source. No, not tomato sauce, we actually call it the source. Now, it could be a spring, a mountain glacier, or just where lots of rain collect. The source is the furthest point from where the river feeds into the sea, which is called the mouth, which we shall look at very shortly. So the source is actually the furthest point inland where a river can start. The next thing we're going to look at is a drainage basin. This is the area where all the rainwater will drain into that one particular river. Of course, it might start off as a stream, which will then go into a smaller river, into a bigger river, but all the water that can get captured into that one river goes into the drainage basin. The next thing you have is a watershed. Now, to try to understand this, imagine you are standing on top of a hill. If you look to your left down into the valley, there is a river, and then if you look to your right, there is a valley. If you are standing on the highest point, everything on one side is going to go into all the small little streams, tributaries, and then into the river, down one side, and then on the other side, all the water is going to go one way. So, in terms of a watershed, everything at the highest point on one side will go one way, and everything on the other side will go down there. Another word that I have mentioned is a tributary. This is a smaller river that tends to join the bigger river, because we tend to label the bigger river and that one tends to dominate. For example, the River Thames is the main river and the River Wey is a tributary. But there are loads of rivers that feed into the River Wey that feed into the River Thames. So a tributary is a smaller river that feeds into a larger river. The next word is my personal favourite because it's nice and long. It is a confluence. A confluence is where two rivers come together. Now, they sort of come together from any sort of side and then they join together to become one bigger river. Quite often you have the Blue Nile and the White Nile. They join together at a confluence to become the River Nile. As we go further down, you have a floodplain. A floodplain is the land which gets flooded when the river overflows. Now, if you live in the UK in winter, quite often you would have read about flooding, and that is where once the water gets over the side, which we call a bank, it will then flood the surrounding areas. Most places have a floodplain, and my kind of video shows you a nice little example of a floodplain. The final part that we're going to look at on this lesson is the mouth. This is the point at which the river joins the sea. So, you can have two rivers come together, which is the confluence, but where the river meets the sea, we call this a mouth. These are the key words for the first part of our geography lesson. We now know the key words, so let's create a picture of a river to help us remember it. Now, for those of you that are very creative, by all means create an amazing or singing or dancing 3D picture, but mine, as you can see, is very simplistic. What I have done is drawn a river as I can draw it, and I've drawn a couple of hills. Those hills are what we call watersheds, and then I've also highlighted in yellow the big drainage basin. What I then did, as you can see on the next picture, is I have labelled it. This way it can act as a reminder on what I've done. If you want to show off, and if this works for your kind of learning style, then by all means add a little explanation as to what each word means, like I have done, but as you will see, it does make your picture quite busy. The important bit is find what learning method works for you. Hi, now we're on to the next stage, and to me the next logical question to ask is, how is it that a river gets wider and a river gets deeper? Well, the fact that a river changes the route that it follows, the meandering path it takes. With this, there are three key words: erosion, transportation, and deposition. The first one, we're going to look at erosion. So logic goes, what is erosion? Erosion is the wearing away of the riverbank by a moving force. In this case, it is actually the water inside the river. So erosion is the wearing away of the sand and the soil on the side, the bank, and at the bottom. This is done in a number of processes. The first one is hydraulic action. Now, within water there are a lot of air bubbles, and on the side of the bank and underneath there is a lot of water. And with a lot of water there's also a lot of air. So what happens is, As the water comes down, it smashes the air against the side of the bank. As it does this, it creates small little cracks as more and more air is forced inside, so the cracks get bigger and bigger, and eventually they break apart. The crack then gets bigger, more air gets in, more water slams against it. This is hydraulic action. The next one is corrasion, corrasion with an A. This is where sand and pebbles are thrown against the bank, and as it is smashed against the side of the bank, it chips away at the bank again. Another word for corrasion is abrasion. So abrasion and corrasion mean the same thing. It's that kind of rubbing away. It's kind of like when you fall over and hurt yourself and you have that little rub. Same kind of concept. The next one is corrosion. Corrosion is where the soil dissolves in the water. Now the best example of this is limestone that slowly over time then starts to dissolve. The next one on the erosion side is attrition. This is where loads of small little pebbles and stones bounce against each other. As they bounce against each other, they wear away and get smoother on the edges. Same concept as to when you walk along the beach, you notice that the stones are actually quite rounded. They're very smooth because they're rubbing against each other, and this is where attrition comes in. So those are the processes that cause erosion inside a river. The next process we are going to look at is transportation. This is where the eroded soil, stones and pebbles, sediment, is moved from higher up the river into the lower course of the river, from upstream to downstream. There are 4 processes in transportation. The very first one is traction. After that it is saltation, we will then look at suspension, and we will finally look at solution. The very first one is traction. Traction is where large boulders roll along the bottom of the river. As they roll along the bottom of the river or stream, they bounce against each other. As they bounce against each other, they chip and get smaller and get rounder. As they get more rounder, so it's easier for them to go downstream. The next one we will look at is saltation. This is where the little stones and pebbles and rocks bounce down. As they bounce down, they have more energy and they bounce against each other. And the next one is suspension. This is where soil dissolves into the water and it changes the colour of the water. In this video there's a very good example where you can see at the bottom is a very, very black, murky liquid, whereas at the top it's crystal clear because there is the suspension of soil within it. The last one is the solution. This is where minerals dissolve into the water. Sometimes it changes the colour, sometimes it doesn't. These are the 4 processes that are used to move soil from one place to another, or not just soil but rocks and pebbles, sediment as we call it, from one part of the river further down the river. The final process we are going to look at is deposition. Now we've looked at erosion. This is where the riverbank is eroded. Transportation, how it's moved from one place to another. The final part is deposition. This is pretty much where the soil and the rocks and stones are deposited. What happens is, as the river goes from the upper course through the middle course to the lower course, it starts to slow down. As it slows down, it loses energy. As it loses energy, the bigger rocks have a lot more resistance and are able to remain where they are. Deposition is where, as the energy is lost, so the soil starts to get deposited because it hasn't got the energy to keep carrying it, it's just too heavy, so it puts it down. So that is what deposition is. If you have a look at this video, you will see a very good example of deposition where you have crystal clear water and then there are loads of stones littered throughout it. And as you can see, the water isn't strong enough to move it. The reason why the water isn't strong enough is because there hasn't been heavy rain. If we have a heavy downpour, there is a lot of water going on, it's able to provide more force and it can move the rocks further down. So deposition is where soil is deposited when it loses energy. Okay, we have now learned the key words for a river. We have now learned about erosion, transportation and deposition. What we now need to do is to actually be able to remember the words and what the words mean. The very first thing you'll notice is there are 18 words associated with keywords, erosion, transportation and deposition. Now, for some of you, just by having it written down is brilliant. You can actually remember how it works. For people like myself, I need to kind of have a bit more to help me remember. What I have done is create a little spider diagram, little web, and as you can see, look at the picture, I have got rivers in the middle and I've divided it into 4 parts: erosion, transportation, deposition, and the key words. Not only have I done that, but I've drawn little pictures to go with it. The problem with this picture is it is quite busy. For some of you it works. Another idea you can do is kind of break it down. So instead of having it all onto one page, you have it over 2 pages. So as you can see, I've done it with keywords. I have all 7 keywords and I've drawn little pictures with it. And I've tried to have a bit of fun, you know, kind of done a bit of a joke to it. So for example, with watershed, I've put, why is my shed in water? The shed isn't in water. A watershed is just a word, but it's how I can remember it. You will then notice, if we look at erosion, I have then got erosion and transportation on the same piece of paper, but on different halves. You will also see the difference between corrosion and corrasion. I kind of highlighted the O and the A. It acts as a nice little reminder for me. And then I've kind of drawn a couple of pictures just to add to it. Now for me, I like to use a bit of humour because it makes it more interesting, but find what process works for you. Okay, so now we have the key words. We have the words that make erosion, we have the words that make transportation, and we have the words that make deposition. The next thing to kind of look at is, how is it that a river changes? For example, if you go near the mouth, the river is moving very slowly, tends to be very wide. Well, we know it gets a lot of tributaries and confluences and loads of other rivers joining it, but why is it going slower? Also, at the source, why is it that the water is travelling a lot quicker? To be able to answer this question, you need to be able to imagine that you can cut the side of the hill in half, from the source to the mouth. And if you're able to cut in half and then squeeze it so we can see it onto one page, you will notice that a river is divided into 3 parts: the upper course, the middle course, and the lower course. We call this the long profile of a river. Upper course is where the source is, and because it tends to be in a mountain range, the water tends to be travelling faster, it has more force, there is a lot more erosion. We will see a lot more waterfalls, and you will see a lot more rapids and a lot more V-shaped valleys, which we'll explain later on. We then have the middle course. This is where it's starting to, the angle is not quite as steep, and there are a lot more rivers coming together, and so the flow is starting to slow down, but it's still going downhill, and you will still see rapids, waterfalls, but you might also start to see some meanders and some floodplains starting to appear. By the lower course, this is where the land is starting to level out. As the land starts to level out, so it doesn't have the same amount of energy. Because it hasn't got the same amount of energy, it starts to deposit a lot more soil, and this affects the route the river takes, causing oxbow lakes, floodplains, delta. Okay, the next process we're going to look at is actually what happens in a river. We're going to look at some of the main features of a river. Now the very first one we're going to look at is a waterfall. A waterfall happens on the upper and the middle course of a river, and you need 2 key ingredients. You need some hard rock and some soft rock. Hard rock is more resilient. It doesn't break down as quickly as soft rock. And what will happen, as you can see in the picture, is the hard rock remains more resilient. As the water goes over, it does erode it, but very slowly. The soft rock, it erodes that a little bit quicker, and you end up creating what's called an overhang. And from the overhang, the water comes falling down. As you can see in my video, you can quite clearly see where it's eroded the softer soil in the back. Where the water falls down, it erodes the bottom of the riverbed, creating what is called a plunge pool, and this is where quite often all the rocks from higher up the stream have landed. The next thing we're going to look at are rapids. Rapids work on the same concept as a waterfall. A rapid happens where you have hard rock and soft rock. The soft rock erodes quicker than the hard rock, and so what ends up happening is, again, steep gradient, upper course, maybe middle course of a river. As it erodes the softer soil, so the water speeds up. It then hits hard rock, then goes over. Soft rock erodes more, soft, hard rock, and then you have this nice little bump effect, which is what makes it very choppy, the water. The next one is a V-shaped valley. Well, a V-shaped valley is precisely what it says. It is the shape of a V. And what's simply happened is the water has just eroded the V shape as it goes on, making it quite definitive. The final one we're going to look at is a kind of 3-in-1: meanders, oxbow lake, and deltas. A meander happens predominantly at a lower course of a river, or where the river gradient is quite slow. Because it's quite gentle, the gradient, it means that there isn't as much force to cause erosion. So the only way the erosion can take place is the water eroding the softer rock. As it erodes the softer rock, it kind of follows that path. So this here will be hard rock, that there will be hard rock. Another thing that happens with the meander is deposition and erosion is taking place. Where it is in red, there is deposition because the water is travelling slower than the outside. On the outside there is erosion. As my video quite clearly shows, you can see deposition taking place on one side, erosion on the other. But what happens is, as the erosion takes place and those two come together, what happens is it cuts off that little corner, and you end up with a lake in it, which they have very originally called an oxbow lake. As the water gets to the mouth, as you can see on this video, where there's rapid deposition taking place, the river doesn't have that much energy, and it has to erode away at the softer rock and not the hard rock. So what happens is you tend to have what they kind of call like a chicken feet, kind of crow's feet, where the water just goes wherever it can erode through the softer rock, forming what is called a delta. These are 6 of the main features that you will find in a river.